Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Grain Farmers of Ontario GrainTALK Webinar. This webinar today examines spring nitrogen applications on winter wheat and what we have learned from the Great Lakes Yen Network. Today on the webinar, we have myself, Laura Ferrier, and Marty Vermey, both with GFO, and joining us is Joanna Fallings. Joanna is the cereals specialist with Omafra, based out of Stratford. She is passionate about supporting Ontario growers with their cereal crop production challenges and opportunities. She is part of the Great Lakes Yen team in Ontario, which is one of a global series of yens that help local farmers better understand their winter wheat yield potential and learn what is limiting that potential. Thanks so much for taking the time to present to us today, Joanna. We can't wait to hear what you have to share.
Great. Thank you so much, Laura. Excited to be here, and it's exciting to be talking about winter wheat today. We've got lots of great wheat in the ground, and so we want to touch on what we can do to optimize our yield potential for this growing season. So we've got some warm weather in the forecast right now. It's early March, and so lots of questions coming in around what we should be doing with our wheat, and what we should be thinking about as we head into spring. So as our winter wheat begins to green up and we're starting to head into spring, one of the best things and the first things that we should be thinking about doing is actually scouting our fields. We should be getting out, getting our boots dirty, and getting in the fields. There's a lot of things that we should be taking note of right now to help us really plan as we get into the busy application season. And so when we're out scouting our fields, there's a couple things we want to be thinking about and looking for right now as things begin to green up. The first is, I guess, to mention is that, when we're thinking about green up in particular, we want to be looking for temperatures that are above 5 degrees Celsius. The average daily temperature is above 5 degrees Celsius. So that's taking your maximum and your minimum daily temperature. So don't just look at those, 13, 14 degree temperatures. We also need to take those nighttime temperatures into consideration. And we need to take an average daily temperature. And that's what we want to be looking at. And we want to have at least a week of temperatures above 5 degrees Celsius. And that's when we're going to start to see that crop green up. So we are seeing that in places like Kentucky, where they're actually approaching growth stage 30 or stem elongation. In the south, we're not quite there yet, but with the temperatures coming this week, we do anticipate to begin seeing that wheat break that dormancy and see that crop green up. So you want to be looking for those temperatures for at least a week. And once we get there, we want to be going out and we want to be looking at a couple of different things. The first is that we want to conduct stand counts. And this is just going to give us a sense of the yield potential of our crop. And we also want to be looking at the health of the plants. So are they well anchored into the soil? Where's the crown of our plant? Do we have seeds sitting on the soil surface? Because those plants are less likely to survive. And so it's important to take note of that. We also want to be looking at the crop staging itself, because this is going to be critical in terms of determining our nitrogen management strategy and understanding where a crop is at based on our planting date. So if we planted early, we're probably quite a bit further along compared to those fields that were planted late into October and even into early November. We want to be looking at things like our weed spectrum and our weed pressure to better optimize our herbicide programs. And we also want to be noting any early signs of disease, especially given the mild temperatures. And then we want to start thinking about our nitrogen management strategy. So when we're out there making our stand assessments, these are some numbers from the University of Guelph to give you a bit of a sense of what we should be looking for. So a full yield or a full stand, or what we'd be looking for, is 66 plants per meter of row, or 20 plants per foot of row. With those 66 plants per meter of row, what we're looking for there is, to get the optimum plants per meter square. And when we get those 66 plants per meter of row, if we times that by 100 and divide by our row spacing, let's say we're in a 7.5 inch row spacing, that gives us 350-ish plants per meter square. And if we're getting 2 to 3 tillers on those plants, we're looking for about 750 to 1,000 heads per meter square. Now, if we get down to 7 plants per foot a row, or 23 plants per per meter of row, that works out to about 300 plants per meter square. But it's in those scenarios, we're going to have a bit of a lower yield potential, and we really want to ensure that if we are getting as low as 7 plants per foot of row or 23 plants per foot of row, that those plants are nice and evenly distributed in the field, and they are healthy and they're all going to survive in order to get us to that 650 to 1,000 heads per meter square, because that's sort of where we want to be. And when we look at the high yielding producers in the end in 2023, for example, our top 3 producers, had 800 to 975 heads per meter square. And if we look at the top 10% of our high yielding producers, which is the green line there on these box plots, those producers were achieving around 1,000 heads per meter square on average. So to get there, we really need to be targeting at least that 66 plants per meter of row or 20 plants per foot of row in order to achieve that head count of 900 plus plants or heads per meter square. So in addition to the actual stand counts themselves, we also need to be looking at the crop staging, because this is going to be extremely important in terms of our nitrogen management decisions. And so it's really critical to go into your fields and look at all of them based on their planting date. So this is a photo from a field. It's the same field actually, but there was a 10-day planting window difference. And you could see here in the plants on the left, this picture was taken on October 23rd, so about 13 days after planting. And you can see that the plants on the left, had just emerged. There were only 1 leaf, where the plants on the right, which were planted 10 days earlier, have a couple more leaves. And so this is really going to influence your nitrogen management decisions. And here's some examples of some plants. This is a photo that was taken on December 11th from a previous year, but you can see the plants on the left, those plants are planted on September 15th, and the plants all the way on the right were planted November 15th. So the plants on the left at September 15th, we've got lots of tillers there, similar to the next plant there, which are plants planted on October 1st. The third plant there is planted October 13th or 15th, so we've got a couple leaves there. And then as we got into November, we had even less growth there. So again, really critical to understand the staging of a crop based on planting date. Because when we get into the spring, this is a picture taken last year on May 5th, you could see that those plants that were planted on September 15th have a lot more growth, have a lot more tillers. And in that bigger wheat, it's even less critical for that very ultra early N applications, because we really are concerned with lodging. In those scenarios, PGRs will help with the lodging, but it may not totally eliminate or control or reduce all of the lodging completely. And so that's why it's really critical to understand the stage of your crop. Whereas the later planted wheat, like the plants on the far right there, we want to ensure that we're maintaining or enticing some more tillering. And so that early nitrogen application is a bit more critical for those plants. So that's why it's important to understand where you are at in terms of your growth stages. Now, when we look at nitrogen management in particular, this is some really great work that was conducted by Peter Johnson and Shane McClure, as well as Josh Nozalski at the University of Guelph. They've just completed this work, and it's really exciting because this is really going to help us better understand when the crop demand is there for that nitrogen. So when we're thinking about our timing, when we're thinking about the amount of nitrogen we need to apply, 50% of the nitrogen is taken up by that plant by second node or by growth stage 32. So it's really critical that we have 50% of the crop's demand for nitrogen there. It's also important to add that this doesn't necessarily mean 50% of nitrogen applied, because we do get a significant amount of nitrogen from the soil, and we need to take that into consideration. We then have an uptake of 70%, so 70% of our total nitrogen is then applied by flagleaf, and 85% is applied by anthesis. So in this study, they looked at 2 different nitrogen rates. They looked at 60 and 165 pounds of nitrogen, and the maximum amount of uptake they had for a crop was 185 pounds. So, we don't need to be out there applying 200 pounds of nitrogen. In this study, they found that once we get to this stem elongation phase, so this rapid uptake, so when that wheat goes from that vegetative sort of flat looking stage to that rapid uptake phase where the wheat looks like it's got very good posture, it's growing much more upright, that's when we know we've hit stem elongation. And when we hit stem elongation, from then all the way up to flag leaf, the crop is taking up 3 pounds of nitrogen per day. And then it drops off, once we get to anthesis, it drops off to 0.4 pounds of nitrogen per day. So from where that crop demand is really from this stem elongation phase up to this flag leaf stage. And that's the critical timing to have that nitrogen there. At that green up phase, that crop is just starting to come out of dormancy. We haven't quite hit that rapid uptake phase. And in those early growth stages, there might be benefit for some of those fields that were planted later, and we need to induce some of that tillering. If we think about that 3 pounds of nitrogen per day, and we think about an application, early on, we need to have something, if we're thinking, it takes about 2 weeks to get from that stem elongation to that second node, that's about 14 to 15 days. And if we're looking at 3 pounds of uptake per day, that's about 45 pounds of nitrogen that would needed to be there by that timing. And when we look at the Great Lakes yen, the top yielding producers are applying anywhere from 130 to 160 pounds of nitrogen. And we did have some producers applying upwards of 180 pounds. But again, as you can see from this study, the max uptake that we are seeing is actually 185 pounds of nitrogen. So this is important to keep in mind when we're thinking about making our nitrogen management decisions. So when we're thinking about timing, we know that our max head size is determined around growth stage 30, and as the data from Peter and Shane there showed, we really need to have enough nitrogen there by growth stage 32 to ensure that grain sites are not lost, and also remember that we can have nitrogen come from the soil. So fields with minimal growth and tillering early in the spring, they tend to benefit from an application of N and S, right up at green up. So this is early in the spring. It could be at that tillering phase prior to stem elongation, and this will help maintain and encourage tillering. If the first application is held off later, when plants reach growth stage 30, we may lose some tillers on that later planted wheat. With that early application, we can then make a second application between growth stage 32 and flag leaf, which is growth stage 39. Whereas in Ontario, if you're looking to make a single application of nitrogen, that tends to be anywhere from green up to growth stage 32. The risk of lodging is greater in those early planted fields with high seeding rates and using a variety that's susceptible to lodging or has lots of tillers. And we can delay our nitrogen application until at least growth stage 30 and apply just a portion up front to reduce our lodging risk by shortening and lowering the stem internodes and discouraging more tillers. And again, the second application be made in the growth stage 32 to 39. When we're also thinking about our timing, we need to think about our soil type as well, because it is an important factor in terms of losses. So N losses tend to be greatest through leaching or denitrification, and those things tend to occur with early applied N on wheat before that rapid uptake, as we talked about at stem elongation up to flag leaf. And so the losses for nitrogen tend to be greater on sand and clay soils, less for loamy soils. And we also need to think about the weather and things like rainfall, which are in the forecast right now. And so again, that early application in winter wheat, where we want to see, from green up through that early stem elongation, tends to be in early to late April. We're not there right now in Ontario. Things are just starting to green up. And if we are making those nitrogen applications now, there is a very big risk for loss, particularly as we get into April, when things tend to start to get wet. Whereas that second application tends to be late April, early May, with that single application again being mid to late April. Now, we get lots of questions around, should I go with a single or split application? And there's a couple of things to take into consideration. Single applications are quite effective. They are convenient, they lower our application costs, and they can also produce very high yields, especially if lodging risk and losses are not a concern. However, when we look at split application, it allows us to make those early nitrogen and sulfur applications, especially in those fields prone to sulfur deficiency, to stimulate or maintain those tillers in that late planted wheat. It also allows us to increase our end use efficiency, especially, if we've got high fertilizer prices, and like right now we've got lower commodity prices, with wheat being about $6 or so less than it was this time last year. It also allows us to tailor our end management strategies based on the season. So while it's warm right now, we could run into a cool, wet April. And so our losses we could see a lot of nitrogen losses in April. And split nitrogen applications also allow for the potential to increase our protein in our hard red wheat varieties. And so this is some great work that was done by Dr. Dave Hooker at the University of Guelph on a couple different years where they looked at split nitrogen applications and the response. And so in 2011, they had a wet year or a wet weather when they were trying to make their second application. And that second application was delayed well beyond that growth stage 32 and even that flag leaf. And there was a reduction in yield because of the late and delayed in application. And knowing from the work that Peter did, knowing that we've got almost 75% of that nitrogen taken up by the crop by flag leaf, it makes sense that we wouldn't see a huge response to those applications that are pushing beyond flag leaf. And then if we look at a year like 23, it was dry weather after the second application. And while the application was made at the right time, we did see a reduction or a delay in that nitrogen uptake because of the dry weather. However, this year seems to be panning out and to look a little bit similar to what we saw in 2012. We had a very warm March, and the weather conditions allowed for optimal timing for both single and split applications. And we did see a pretty significant response to that split application. That was because we did have a warm March and there was a lot of opportunity for end losses in April. So that split application did pay because we were able to reduce our losses versus in a split application versus trying to put it all up front in March. So again, 2012 is a similar year, and likely split applications and we anticipate split applications to being a benefit, particularly on a year like this where we're starting to see that wheat green up in March. Now, when we're thinking about our rates, this is some really great work done by Emma Dillman at the University of Guelph, and she looked at four different planting dates: early, ultra early, a mid early, mid late, and ultra late. And then she looked at two management strategies. She looked at a standard strategy, which was about 110 pounds of nitrogen and 20 pounds of sulfur, compared to about 150, 160 pounds of nitrogen, and again with 20 pounds of sulfur. And what Emma found was that if we had a late planting date, we were not able to achieve the same yield potential as the earlier planting dates, even with management. So on a year like this, where commodity prices are reduced and nitrogen prices, are a little bit expensive, we might need to think and take into consideration the yield potential of our crop. If we've got a lower yield potential, we may be able to pull back on our nitrogen rates a little bit. We don't want to pull back on them completely, but we may not need to take a full intensive management approach to those later planted fields because our yield potential there is lower. So that's just something to keep in mind. As we're trying to think about deciding on our rates in our fields, it's important to think about that planting date and the yield potential of the crop itself. When we're thinking about nitrogen management for hard red wheat, we know that split applications are necessary in order to make protein. So we know that generally speaking, we need about 150 to 160 pounds of nitrogen with sulfur in there. And we do see a benefit to split applying that amount of nitrogen to help increase that protein. And a product like Amidas which is a dry product with both nitrogen and sulfur. If we apply that, just prior to flag leaf or close to flag leaf, as we showed previously, we're not likely to see an increase in yield with those later applications at flag leaf, but we do see a consistent increase in protein, which is extremely critical for hard red winter wheat. And this is some work conducted by Black Creek Research in partnership with C&M Seeds and Yara. And what they looked at was applying all of the nitrogen up front in hard red winter wheat varieties. So they applied 160 pounds of 28 up front with ATS compared to split applying that ATS and using also split applying with ATS and 28% versus Amidas. And with the Amidas product, they were able to see less injury on that flag. We weren't burning those leaves. And they did see, a nice consistent response and a positive yield response. But more importantly, they saw a consistent response when it comes to protein. So anywhere from 0.2 up to almost 2% protein increase with that Amidas product closer to flag leaf. So that's going to be specific for hard red growers. Is to keep that in mind, and we might need to manage that a little bit differently compared to some of the soft red varieties. Now, when we're looking at sulfur, the rapid uptake phase for that is again from semi-elongation up to flag leaf, where they're taking up 72% of that sulfur up to flag leaf, and 90% of that sulfur is actually taken up by anthesis. And so again, it just reiterates that the importance of getting that sulfur in that first application. If we're split applying, does it really make sense for us to continue to apply that sulfur, as late if 72% of that sulfur is already taken up by flag leaf? And the max recorded amount of sulfur uptake in the study was an amount of 14 pounds per acre. And so, again, in Ontario trials, we've seen a response in some work that Peter Johnson and Shane McClure did, as well as some work with John Lozon, Ben Rosser, and myself and Horst Bonner in winter wheat. We saw a response 25% of the time, and we saw an average response of 3 bushels per acre. And so where we're going to see that consistent response is really going to be in those sandy soils, fields with no history of manure application, and those fields that have a history of sulfur deficiency. And we tend to see sulfur deficiency early in the season when soils are still cool and we're not getting that mineralization. So again, it's likely a really good approach to continue to apply those sulfur or to make those sulfur applications with that first nitrogen application in that rapid uptake phase. In fields that are planted early, we've got really aggressive seeding rates, lots of yield potential there. This is where we need to potentially consider a PGR, especially as we push nitrogen rates. So again, early planted wheat, high yield potential. Variety is very, very critical here. Some varieties don't respond to PGRs. We don't see that same shortening because the lodging risk there is just low. So understanding how your variety responds to PGRs is a great, and understanding its lodging potential is helpful. GoCereals.ca or GoCrops.ca is a good resource for that information. If your field has a history of manure applications, PGRs may also be beneficial there. And then again, as I mentioned, if you are using an intensive wheat management program, early planted, high seeding rates, aggressive nitrogen rates, so rates above 150 pounds of nitrogen. If you are making those early applications on those fields, we would definitely want to be considering a PGR in those situations, even if we're split applying our nitrogen. Just quickly here, I wanted to touch on a couple other things in addition to that nitrogen management is really around weed control and disease management. And so we've got lots of fields that were not able to get a fall herbicide applied. It was a difficult fall to get some wheat planted. We didn't really get a chance to get those herbicide applications made. And it's really critical at this time to be making note of what weed spectrum you have and also the stage of the wheat, because we should be making our herbicide applications based on the stage of those weeds. And you can see in this photo here, we've got chickweed that is flowering, and we want to be targeting our herbicide applications before that chickweed flowers. We also want to be ensuring that these Candida fleabane rosettes are small. They are more easy to manage when they are small. So we don't want those to get growing and get big and delaying those herbicide applications, because that's also going to reduce our efficacy. Another weed that we really need to be on the lookout, while this tended to be, conducive to certain areas, we are starting to see it expand beyond just those typical areas. For example, Niagara, where we are starting to see it beyond that, and that is bluegrass. So bluegrass competition in winter wheat can result in losses of up to 50%. They primarily emerge in the fall, but they can also emerge in the spring. And we really want to be, targeting our herbicide applications prior to those plants reaching 10 centimeters in height. Early spring applications also provide much better control than fall applications, because we can still have some of those plants emerge. And both fall and early spring applications are much better, or provide much better control than late spring applications. So if we're going in late in the spring, we're really going to see a reduction in the efficacy there. And it's also important to positively identify the species of bluegrass you're dealing with, whether it's annual bluegrass or rough stalk bluegrass, because that's going to have an influence on the product you apply. And just to give you a sense, like, annual bluegrass makes up about 60% of the bluegrass we see. It's a winter annual, whereas rough stalk bluegrass is about 26% of what we see in fields, and it's actually a perennial. So again, it's really important to understand the species you're dealing with, because it could influence the type of herbicide that we're going to select for control of that weed species. And then we also want to be on the lookout for early season diseases. So we know Septoria on the right there is a typical disease we see early in the season, but on the left is the disease powdery mildew, which is a disease we should particularly be on the lookout this year. It tends to like and thrive after mild winters. So we've had a mild winter. We've also had areas that have had some pretty significant pressure with this disease in the last couple of years. So if you're anywhere sort of north and east of London, so, if you're going into Oxford and Waterloo, Grey County, Bruce County, Huron, and up into Dufferin, in those areas, we have seen some pretty significant powdery mildew pressure in some of those regions. And so we want to be keeping a lookout for that, especially given the mild winter. And so as we get into the busy season, right now we've got lots of time to make decisions and think about our nitrogen applications and think about our herbicide applications. But the weather can be very challenging, and we can sometimes have very small windows of opportunity to make those applications. And so this is one of the most common questions we get through the growing season, and that is, how many products can a tank mix together? And so a general recommendation or a general guideline is to consider your surfactant load. So if you've got a high surfactant load, we may need to take something out of the tank. And if you do have a fairly high surfactant load there with the number of products, we really should be avoiding any applications if the temperature drops below 3 degrees the day before, the day of, and the day after, so that plant has the ability to metabolize those products and isn't getting that injury. And again, just some guidance there in terms of T3 fungicides to avoid anything injurious in the tank with that. But again, we should really be making our herbicide applications earlier in the season, targeting those weed species and the staging of those weed species, whereas our fungicide applications are probably best suited to a PGR timing, or at that stem elongation phase, when those diseases are starting to become a challenge there. If we apply too early, we may not see that same benefit from that fungicide application, versus applying that herbicide too late, we may not get that same weed control that we're looking for. If you're looking for information on trying to determine, the best herbicide for the weed spectrum, or a fungicide for the disease spectrum you're dealing with, the OMAFRA Crop Protection Hub is a great resource. You can just Google OMAFRA Crop Protection Hub, and in there you can select your crop, you can select the pest species you're dealing with. So whether it's a weed species or insect pest or disease, you can select that, and it'll generate some options there for you. So I just threw in some foliar applied fungicides in wheat, and this is what it spit out for me. So it's a great resource to help you determine the products that are best suited to your needs. And then, of course, for those, who are trying to really time those PGRs, who are trying to time their nitrogen applications based on growth stages and their herbicide application, as well as their T3 fungicide applications, the winter wheat staging guide is a great resource for you. It can help you identify those stages correctly. So I'd encourage you to reach out for that if you're looking for some help in identifying your crop growth stages. And this is really what the Great Lakes Yen wheat workers or wheat producers are doing. They are making those applications of their nitrogen and their crop protection products based on, the staging of their crop, and are really timing those to the needs of the crop, as opposed to just taking a blanket of approach of managing their acres. So I would really encourage you to try to get out and properly stage your fields to help you maximize your applications throughout the season. And if you have any questions as you're going through the season, whether it's for nitrogen rates, nitrogen timing, crop protection product questions, please do not hesitate to reach out. Thank you very much.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Joanna. I know before we started recording, I said, oh, I've got a few questions for you, and you answered them all. It was just a really overarching, just really well done presentation on winter wheat and how to manage it as we approach the spring. And yeah, as you said, with those winter wheat guides, you've got some, we've got some. So if anybody's interested in grabbing one, we can definitely connect them to a winter wheat guide. CCA credits are available for this webinar. I forgot to mention that at the beginning. So if there are certified crop advisors who are watching this, please email me and I will be able to make sure that your that the credits will be applied. I'm also just going to open this up to Marty if he has any questions for you from.
Yeah, Joanna, you're very thorough and covered a lot
Yeah.
of things that farmers need help with this spring, as understanding how to manage their crops very well. One thing I do hear from farmers quite a bit, and because scouting is so important, and Laura and I always indicate to farmers, you got to scout your fields, you got to know what's going on and identify things, and you covered that extremely well. One thing I hear from farmers is that, yeah, I know I got to do plant counts, but it's so difficult. It's so hard. How do I tell the difference between the main plant and a tiller? And I think with that one slide that you covered off with your plants, you meant the main plant. Could you describe something that could help farmers understand how to identify it better? How can they do the best job possible of doing their plant stand counts?
Yeah, so one of the things that you can do is if you dig up a plant or two, you can find that seed and you can identify what is actually coming out of that seed. And if you take a plant or two and do it that way, it gives you a good sense of what an individual plant looks like in your field, because those smaller plants can be quite easy, especially if they've only got, say, 3 leaves. Those are easily to identify. But you're right, as you get into denser plant stands, it's a little more difficult. So I would recommend digging up a couple plants to give you a sense of what each individual plant actually looks like in your field. So find that seed, find that crown, and you can see, what is the main stem and what are the tillers. And once you have a sense of what each individual plant is kind of the staging it's at, then it's a little bit easier to identify what is an individual plant within the row itself. So definitely dig up some plants. Digging up the plants not only helps you, better identify an individual plant itself, but it can give you a sense of where the crown is placed. Is it too shallow? Is it well anchored into the soil? You can get a look at the roots and ensure that those are healthy and growing. And that's actually also a way to help you determine if your plant is actually greening up. If you're seeing those nice, bright white new roots coming out, that also is an indication that your plant is coming out of dormancy and it's in that green up phase, and it is it's in that green up phase. So identifying those really nice bright roots is super helpful as well. But digging up those plants is one of the best ways to just see what a single plant looks like. And then from there, you're able to better assess them within the row itself. And I appreciate it can be quite tedious in the spring, but trust me, it's so beneficial if you do this even once in the season, especially before you're making your nitrogen applications. It just really helps you tailor your management and helps you maximize the potential of the crop that you have there.
I think that's great advice, Joanna, because even doesn't matter what the crop is, a lot of farmers are afraid to disturb their plants. They want to leave them growing. But to do a good assessment, grab a shovel and take a look at the roots. Every crop, you need to analyze the roots to see if you got compaction, what your planting depth was. Those are really good hints. I greatly appreciate that.
Yeah, and
one
I
other-
guess one more mention, sorry, is just make sure you're doing counts in multiple areas of the field. I don't know if I mentioned that, but don't just walk in the headlands and make that count, right at the entrance. Like make sure you're going through the whole field or a good portion of it to get a sense of what the field looks like and don't just cherry pick, a spot in the headlands.
And the work with the Great Lakes Gen, we really identified like nitrogen management. And I think with the soil type, you really hit that hard on this presentation. And I think when a lot of farmers say, oh, I'm on sandy soil, I can't get wheat yields. I think it's probably, and one thing we can analyze in the future is those on the different soil types and how they're managing it. Because what you talked about, lower CECs and sandier soils, it doesn't hold the nitrogen, and probably spoon feeding a crop on sand, just like with any other crop they're growing. You really need to do that with wheat and higher management in those types of soils to manage your nitrogen. So your talk this morning was excellent on that. One other thing I want to mention too, and here it's, what is it, March 6th already, and our wheat down here in the Southwest is starting to get green. We haven't had, I don't think, the continuous 7 days yet of average temperatures of 5 degrees Celsius. But the wheat has really greened up, and it's a great idea to take a look at those plants and roots. A lot of farmers this winter were concerned the wheat's brown, it's dead. Now is a great time, as you mentioned, take a look at those white roots. You can see if it's actually growing. I'm sure further north, maybe it's not quite as green yet, and it still looks like it's dormant, but that's a great idea to dig those plants and take a look at your plant health.
Yes, absolutely. I could not agree more. So if you have any questions as you're going through the growing season, whether it's about nitrogen management, crop protection products, anything, that you need assistance with, please feel free to reach out. And also want to say a big thank you to the Grain Farmers of Ontario, as well as the MAFRA U of G partnership, for supporting a lot of the research mentioned in this, the Great Lakes Yen, the PGR project, the Split Nitrogen project, the Nutrient Uptake project. Without the support of grain farmers and the partnership, these research initiatives would not be possible. So a big thank you to those as well.
Great. Thank you so very much, Joanna, for taking the time today.
Thank you.